This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Your planet is now marked for death.
Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four First Steps is now streaming on Disney+.
We will protect you.
As a family.
Light him up, Johnny!
Marvel's first family is certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes.
That is fantastic.
And critics say it's one of the best superhero movies of all time.
Oh!
Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four First Steps, now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG-13.
What time is it, Ben? It's slobber time!
Drink? Now, shall we begin? Hello, the great historian Antony Beevor joins today to discuss his new book Rasputin. So we talk the Mad Monk, Russia, then and now, and Putin's grip on history. If you're listening on Apple, I'd love it if you can leave a kind star rating. Please do share the pod with family and friends, but in the meantime, let's get on with it. Sir Antony, a huge pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining me.
Great to be with you.
I'm so pleased that I was able to speak to you because of course, your distinguished career, but also the subject of your latest book is such a fascinating one. And I was trying to think, because I was wondering, Russia is clearly a fascination for you. And I suppose as it should be for most people who are interested in history, but you're described often as a military historian. I don't know if that's something
I reject. I reject.
Splendid.
No, I follow the great Professor Sir Michael Howard's argument to us all. And he said, you are not military historians, you are historians of war. And he's quite right, because basically we should be covering the suffering of civilians, of women and children and old men, or as well as soldiers in the front line. So the term of military historian is one that one always tries to avoid if possible.
I'm glad to hear it. And also then, in that vein, I mean, is this then your third and a half book on Russia, or fourth? Because the Berlin book, I know it's of course about the Battle of Berlin, but the huge amount of it involves, the Red Army.
Of course, yeah.
So I wondered if we can count it as your fourth book on Russia.
Well, I don't count books particularly in that way.
No.
No, I mean, then there was Olga Chekova as well. So,
yes, of course.
So Russia comes in many different ways, even with the Spanish Civil War. So I wouldn't sort of bother to specify in those particular ways. But the point, in a way, of this one is it is, of course, a prequel, if you like, to my previous one of Russia, Revolution and Civil War, because it's vital to understand the circumstances. But also, the real thing is I've always been fascinated by Rasputin, not just as a character, but partly because, of course, he encapsulates all of the contradictions in the Russian character. And it is important to realize, I don't think that we will ever properly understand Russia. As the great poet Fyodor Tyutchev said in the 19th century, Russia cannot be understood with the mind alone, which is a brilliant remark and absolutely true, and a very famous one. And here we have Rasputin, who is a combination of everything going in totally contrary directions. And we see it today. I mean, we know with Putin, just before he invades Ukraine, insists in his essay and in all of his speeches that the Ukrainians are just other Russians or whatever. And then as soon as they resist, they immediately become sort of subhuman Nazis. So, I mean, one has to be able to understand how Russia can say opposite things and still believe it at any moment of time.
Yes, I was trying to think about Rasputin. Does he represent a kind of transition, or is he a sort of a figurehead for a sort of medieval Russia? And
Well,
then and
well, I
then
mean, there are elements, certainly. I mean, no country is as much a prisoner of its own past as Russia. And that's certainly true when you look back over religion. Every time that there's been an attempt to modernize, especially under Peter the Great and the old believers who were persecuted. Not that Rasputin was necessarily an old believer or anything like that. Many suspected that he was at least one of the many different sects. So one has to understand this whole idea of sort of Russian spirituality. And here we have it in one particular Siberian peasant who is deeply spiritual, but at the same time utterly lascivious. He is incredibly corrupt. He's surrounded by corruption, which is one of the contributory factors towards the revolution in February 1917. But at the same time, he's giving all his money away. So you see, he's also a social climber in many ways, and yet at the same time firmly believes that he is protecting and acting as a voice for the peasantry and the poor at the feet of the throne. And most striking of all, he is convinced in so many ways that actually he loves women, and yet here he is, and he's also a part-time rapist. So, who is this character? And this is one of the reasons why he is so intriguing, but above all because he is the absolute counter to the great man theory of history. Here we have somebody who has more influence on 20th century history than almost anybody else because of the knock-on effect. As Kerensky said, without Rasputin, there would have been no Lenin. And so, the whole of the pattern of the 20th century, to a large degree, was partly influenced by a virtually illiterate Siberian peasant who had happened to get into a position in an almost cult-like way, a position of total influence, and therefore helped bring down the greatest autocracy that the world has ever seen.
yes, it's extraordinary that he managed to do that. I mean, we do see. I have to. Don't judge me too harshly, but I was trying to think of. Is there a sort of similar figure that we've seen more recently? And I was thinking, I don't want to slander us here, but I'm not. I wondered whether Dominic Cummings or someone like Peter Mandelson, who have this sort of habit of really beguiling leaders and influencing them. And in the case of Mandelson, he's sort of politically killed a number of times, but keeps on coming back. Do you think that we do suffer from a kind of political leaders are always looking for a sort of an individual who will really tell them how it is, tell them like it is? And
well, there is, yes, that can certainly happen. But I'm afraid I spend my time or a lot of my time as a historian, trying to fight against these similarities of history. It's been one of the most disastrous things of the 20th century, particularly in reference to the Second World War. I mean, the compulsion of the media and above all of politicians, whenever there is a crisis, to make some comparison to the Second World War, to emphasize it. That, to start looking for parallels, I find, is actually one of the more dangerous things that we get involved in. And we've been seeing it recently, with Ukraine. There are a lot of superficial parallels, particularly with the Munich agreement in 1938 and all the rest of it. To what degree are the Ukrainians, the Sudeten Germans of today, or the Czechs, this, that, or the other? I mean, I think it's dangerous, and I don't think it helps. Yes, we can learn from history, and we can learn the mistakes. And the one mistake we should certainly learn is both before the First World War, then again after the First World War, we were, because of democratic confirmation bias, were always assuming that actually authoritarian and dictatorship governments and dictatorships were really quite similar to us. It's just a question of them understanding. I mean, before the First World War, there was the Norman Angell book, which persuaded everybody that war was impossible in Europe in 1914 because of increased communications and trade. Well, that mistake was again made by Angela Merkel, Schroeder, and so forth, in the early 2000s. In the interwar years, the British and the French could not believe that anybody would be stupid enough to want another First World War after what they had seen of the trenches and so forth, and they totally underestimated Hitler's determination to have another war. We made that mistake with Putin. Nobody believed that there would ever be. Well, there were one or two notable exceptions who did fear it, but the vast majority of political leaders and certainly of the media never believed that there would be another land war on the European or the Eurasian landmass, as we've seen in Ukraine. So we get it wrong time and time again, and a lot of it is due to making, I think, false parallels.
Well, I know that Fiona Hill, who was the co-author of the recent Strategic Defence Review, in a talk, I think the day before yesterday, was saying that we're
I was there, and I saw, yes, and I talked to her afterwards. Yes, indeed, yeah.
I find that quite interesting because one sees with sort of warfare now, we are in this modern age of unmanned devices that are on the battlefield causing all sorts of trouble. And I wondered, actually, when one thinks of her comments, that this does sort of ring true. We're in a kind of Ukraine is a proxy war for us in this new era.
Well, it is, but so was the Spanish Civil War, a proxy war during the 1930s. And she's absolutely right. I mean, in fact, we only got to look at the news this morning about the battle between Hegseth and Anthropic, and their refusal to allow the Pentagon to use their AI Claude material for totally unmanned and uncontrolled automatic weapons platforms. I mean, we are in a very, very terrifying way and position. And I mean, in fact, most wars, like the Spanish Civil War in its own curious way, are a mixture of wars past, wars present, and wars future. And we're certainly seeing this mixture at the moment with the Ukrainians quite brilliantly improvising, inventing, and creating the weapons of the future simply to survive. But where is that going to leave us, in the next 15 years? Not even that.
Well, yes. And if we look at our own country, I mean, I was reading that we, as a population, I think only a quarter of us believe that there are external threats or there's a threat of war. And this is in the context of defense spending. And if one takes out our nuclear deterrent Trident spending, I think we only spend 1.75% of GDP, which
Yes,
ranks us very low.
Well, of course it is. It isn't just a question of the percentage of GDP. It is the attitude and the idea that we know what we're supposed to spend, but nothing is being spent at the moment. None of the contracts are being signed. I mean, we are in a far more vulnerable position now than we ever were before the Second World War. And from that point of view, I'm afraid the government has got to not only face up to its own responsibilities, but, face the possibility if it does find itself at war and we are totally unprepared, it has failed in its primary duty as a government, which is the defense of the country.
I was very interested with Rasputin himself. He has this kind of. It would be easy to take a sort of moral stand with someone like him because he is this sort of extraordinary figure, and that's been a real trend in the last few years. Is for a sort of moral judgment on. We certainly judge the past by our standards of today, but where does that place us with someone like Rasputin, who's I mean, he is this most extraordinary figure capable of horrific acts, but also, as you say, a great proponent for the Russian peasantry.
Well, here's, as I say, this complete contradiction. I don't think that Me Too would have any trouble condemning him. Quite rightly so, of the way. But I mean, what was fascinating is the way he, in St. Petersburg at that particular time, which was an utterly patriarchal society, was the one person who could sort of listen to women and all the rest of it. And this is why they were sort of throwing themselves at his feet. The men, of course, regarded him as not just an upstart, but the idea that he should speak to everybody, whether a housemaid or a princess, in exactly the same way, was, of course, regarded as appalling and deeply shocking and all the rest of it. And as for the imperial family themselves, I mean, the mother of the Tsar was the most horrified of all because she, when pregnant with Tsar Nicholas, had had this terrifying dream that this baby had appeared in her arms as she was walking up a mountain with her husband Alexander III. And suddenly the baby had leapt out of her arms, scrambled up the mountain ahead of her, and there was a peasant standing with an axe who chopped off the baby's head. And so when 38 years later she hears that her son and daughter-in-law have become completely besotted with the Siberian peasant, she is the one who sort of leads a revolt against Rasputin. So you find, and one of the fascinating parts of the whole story are these sort of, if you like, family battles on both sides in this sort of struggle for power and influence. And of course, once Rasputin had started managing to cure the worst symptoms of the Tsarevich's hemophilia, he was in a position where the Empress would not allow any attack upon him whatsoever, and she regarded him entirely as a saint. She, having been brought up as a sort of German Protestant, but then as an English, basically, almost as an English granddaughter of Victoria, then became, more Russian than the Russians in her belief in the Orthodox Church and the power of icons, of holy icons, and all the rest of it, and would not listen to a word of criticism against him.
There's a brilliant quote that you've put in the book, which was made by a German diplomat.
Oh yes, well that's a famous one from the past. It's true that
Yes.
Russia as a regime. You've probably got it off. I can't remember the exact words, but basically you were saying, it's sort of an autocracy tempered by assassination.
Yes, indeed. However, we haven't really seen have we? I don't think we've seen a premiere or an assassination right at the top of the Russian government since the murder of Nicholas II.
Well, we're seeing quite a few at the moment, thanks to the Ukrainians. But
Well,
the
yes.
generals being taken out here and
Yes.
there.
Yes, but
In a
Putin
fairly
seems,
targeted,
utterly safe, doesn't he?
a fairly targeted way. But yes,
Yes.
of course. I mean, Putin has taken every precaution that he should. I mean, what's so ridiculous and in a way amusing is the way that he has these identical rooms built in all these different places, so nobody can know exactly where they are. But apparently, they've now worked out online exactly which is which, because that radiator is actually 4 inches further to the right than that one, and all the rest of it. So. No, the other thing about, of course, is about his, shall we say, his home decoration, whether it's the Kremlin or the palace on the Black Sea, is that there ain't a hammer or sickle to be seen. They're all the double-headed eagles of the Romanovs. And this is where Putin was clever in the way that he managed to bring back together, in a way, the two sides of the civil war, the Reds and the Whites. I mean, he shot communists and others in Russia by bringing back the bodies of some of the white generals to have them reburied with honors in Russia. And his view, of course, is the Russian Empire. He may have made remarks about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the worst geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. But he was the one who criticized Lenin wrongly for the loss of Ukraine. He could have criticized Lenin for the loss of Finland. That's certainly true in 1918. But he basically is an old Russian imperialist. And his ideologues, Vladimir Medinsky, who's now, I mean, this is terrifying, is actually supposedly leading the negotiations on peace with Ukraine. I mean, Medinsky is one of the ones, like Dugan and Alexander Dugan, who believes that the whole of the Eurasian landmass from Vladivostok to Dublin should all be under the control of Russia, the Holy Orthodox Church, and all the rest of it, because the West is so corrupt and bisexual, and I don't know what else, and therefore they will sort of save the morality of the white nations of the Eurasian landmass. Well, I mean, the whole thing is so preposterous, but at the same time, there is a large element which they believe in.
Putin obviously is not militarily capable of delivering on that idea because although European defence spending is so low, he could probably have a go. But such as his experience in Ukraine, presumably fighting on a new front in the Baltics or Poland would be too much.
Well, it would be. I mean, they can certainly cause a lot of trouble there, Suwalki Gap and Kaliningrad and so forth. But at the same time, with the Finns being able to put 300,000 into the field, which is staggering, and has got the best artillery probably even in the world. They would certainly on the northern flank stand very little chance. Poland has also invested enormously, and the Poles are fighters. So I don't think there's going to be a major collapse in the north, even though a lot of trouble can be done. I mean, I was down lecturing to my old regiment the other day because they're off to Estonia's lead battle group once again, and. Yes, there is going to be problems of insufficient coordination. We have not got, obviously, a unified European army, even if that is necessarily the right way. It is certainly the NATO structure, which has got to be maintained. But, I mean, the problem is going to be much more in the south. I mean, the real areas of vulnerability are going to be Georgia, Moldova, Transnistria, Moldova, and so forth. So, I mean, we've got to very much more keep an eye down there, as well as the strength in the Baltic region, which in the old days was called Baltap, Baltic approaches.
There's been a new translation of Thucydides recently. And of course, he was quoted by Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister.
Yes.
But is Putin delivering on that sort of? This is a truism of realpolitik. You need to build up your military strength, your literal power, in that regard.
Well, of course you do. But I mean, there was, as I was saying, this sort of democratic confirmation bias, especially in that period of after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the idea of the peace dividend and all the rest of it. And because it was so self-evident to the democratic countries of Western Europe that warfare was madness, it was never going to be, it would never take place, they again took their eye off the ball completely. So they didn't learn from the war in Chechnya, which was unbelievably brutal. It was very much the old Russian way of war, i.e., conspicuous cruelty as a weapon of war. And then what about Syria? And I know only about one or two people who are quite convinced that Putin was going to go for Ukraine well before, even before 2014. So, by the time of 2014, it was quite clear what Putin was going to do at some stage or another.
There was Georgia in 2008, wasn't there?
Well, there was Georgia in 2008, yes, but people didn't. I mean, to a certain degree, you could say that the Americans had handled Georgia rather badly. It was an unnecessary provocation. The whole Ossetian business and all the rest of it was incredibly complicated. So people didn't, and because also the Russian army performed in such a chaotic way, nobody took that very seriously.
Does Russia remain then? I mean, Russia always has this idea of itself, and of course, the Second World War. I was Russia more than probably even more than our own country has a sort of World War II obsession. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yes, absolutely, no doubt about it. I mean, of course, it's a very much a central national myth. But I mean, the trouble with the Second World War is it was a war like no other, and yet it's become everybody's definition of war itself. And that's been true to a certain degree for us. And every country on the whole has tended to look at it in terms of its own personal experiences rather than seeing the international aspects. In fact, it was an extraordinary effect, in fact, one of the greatest effects in the whole of world history, which is why it's become so central to our thinking, to our imagination, because it accelerated the integration of world history, partly because of its global reach, but also because of bringing colonialism in Africa, in the Far East, in Asia generally, to an end. But yet we still tend to forget this essential international aspect. We all still look at it in national terms. And in that sense, the Russians are even more specific in that particular way, because for them it is, the definition of their own state, their own heroism, their own self-image. And basically, when one talks about the generalization, or you try to generalize about a country, which is again a very dangerous thing to do, there isn't any DNA for any country at all, of course, but there is a form of self-image, there is a form of national narrative, which people tend to sort of play up to or live up to. Less so nowadays, it's certainly true, but in all of that sort of post-war period, people did very much see their country entirely through those particular lenses.
But and is there a sort of frustration in Russia because a lack of awareness from the West that I think was it 3 in 4 Germans who were killed in Europe were killed fighting the Russians?
It was just over the 80% mark of the percentage of Wehrmacht casualties. But at the same time, Putin tried to argue on several occasions that we could have won the war without the British and the Americans. But that's absolute rubbish because both Khrushchev, Marshal Zhukov, and even Stalin all privately admitted that without American aid, the Soviet Union would have collapsed almost certainly in in 42. So, you can argue it. Well, one can also argue very powerfully that whatever you may think about the strategic bombing offensive of the British and American bombers against against Germany, it forced the Luftwaffe to withdraw the bulk of their fighter squadrons from the Eastern Front and, of course, their 88mm anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns to defend the Reich against the British and the Americans. And this actually had a vast effect in giving air superiority to Soviet aviation, really from the Battle of Kursk onwards. So, I mean, there are a lot of different elements. One can go on arguing in different directions of why and how the war swung in the way that it did.
Yes. So just going back to Rasputin, there's so much myth making with him. I think there is the story that the body was never found and this kind of thing. And I wondered, how did you kind of...
The body was found. I mean, I've got a
Yes.
photograph of the body being defrosted for the autopsy. Yes.
I think it was the film Nicholas and Alexandra that he sort of disappears off into through some sort of snowy clouds and is not seen again.
Well, no, that's certainly not true. I mean, it was a very grisly murder. It was a very grisly and unbelievably incompetent plot. I refer to it as Russian farce. You could. But yes, there were obviously lots of myths. I mean, huge myths have grown up, and many of them still sort of still echo onwards today. But which is, I think, one of the important things, because the vital aspect is that historians in the past have always tended to underestimate the power of rumor. I mean, they've taken the rather official position, if it's not in an official archive, it's not true, which is a load of rubbish, because we all know perfectly well how official archives actually can be incredibly dishonest. But at the same time, it was something that I learned a number of years ago, or whatever. You do need to know what's going on, what people are saying. Even if it's just conversation at dinner parties, and sort of people were terrified about what's going to happen next week. Is it going to be a coup d'état from the right or a coup d'état from the left or whatever? And in Russia, and especially in Petrograd during the First World War, all of the rumors of whether about Rasputin sleeping with the Empress or even with the Empress's daughters contributed in this patriarchal society to the whole idea that the Tsar was a cuckold. And in a society like Russia, the idea that sort of, the Tsar of all the Russias should be cuckolded by a Siberian peasant was one of the reasons why officers did not draw their swords in defense of the regime come February 1917 and the outbreak, really, of the real popular revolution, not, of course, the Bolshevik coup d'etat of October.
Now, how easy is it to understand what the Russian peasantry thought of Rasputin? Their kind of great hero. It's probably quite difficult to tell.
Well, most of them had probably never heard of Rasputin, even though anybody who, say, read or had access to a newspaper of any form would have heard about almost nothing but Rasputin. So, I mean, it's a little bit like sort of, in Russia today, those who have analog televisions, will only hear Kremlin propaganda, and they won't have a clue about anything else outside it. So, no, the peasantry had very little idea, but the reaction generally was, when he was finally murdered by Prince Felix Yusupov, married to the Tsar's favorite niece, and by the Archduke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's favorite nephew, the idea that Rasputin, was sort of being murdered by the aristocracy when he had got close to the Tsar, that sort of great Romanov myth that sort of, the Tsar's closeness to the peasantry, the Batyushka Tsar, was, of course, fundamentally undermined, to put it mildly. So it didn't necessarily contribute purely because Rasputin was a peasant, the fact that he was murdered by the aristocracy or by grandees. From their point of view, Rasputin, let's face it, was very close to the monarchy. So there was a lot of confusion in that particular way. But by then, of course, it was too late. I mean, if they had murdered Rasputin or if he'd been killed in 1914, when he was stabbed and nearly died, that would have changed things enormously. But not being murdered until December 1916, that meant that sort of all of the damage that he had done to the reputation of the family of the Tsar and of the Empress had already been inflicted.
Do we know at all, is there any kind of comments made of what Putin thinks of this figure in Rasputin?
Well, he does mention somewhere the fact that his grandfather, I think he was Spiridon, and whether this is true or not, I've got no idea, was the chef in the Astoria Hotel where Rasputin occasionally would dine. And so Putin would claim that he would give a sort of 20 ruble gold coin as a tip to his grandfather. But I mean, whether you're going to believe that or not, I have no idea. I certainly don't really believe it. But I mean, it's a way, I think, of Putin somehow getting himself into the story. But there we go.
Yes, of course. Yes. Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, there are wonderful images in the book. I mean, of Rasputin sort of dipping his hand into fish stew and handing out chunks to.
Oh, yes. Well,
yes.
this is a thing of, in a way, of sort of slightly of humiliating in a semi-Christ-like way, passing around food from his hands. Fish soup had always been his absolute favorite ever since childhood. And these women who would take fish bones from his plate, or even pieces of chewed morsel from his plate, nail clippings off his hands, which they would then sew into their dresses as talismans. I mean, unbelievable. But this was part, if you like, of the cult atmosphere which surrounded him.
Yes, it's the most extraordinary story. So this has been wonderful. Thank you. And so I do encourage listeners to click on the link so that they can buy the book. But thank you so much for joining me. It's very kind of you to give me your time.
Not at all, Ollie. Okay, all the best.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time. I was